Kennedy is using the phone when Police Chief Arena comes into his own office. He says, "Hello, Senator, I'm Jim Arena." Kennedy hung up and came around the desk to shake Arena's outstretched hand, and he says, "Hello, Jim." He notes that Kennedy is the one who was in the car accident, and the police chief is the police chief, and yet one of them is behind the desk in dry clothes, and one of them has just come in wet clothes, and they're the exact opposite of what they ought to be. If there's a car accident involving water, the person who was in the accident ought to be the one walking into the police chief's office, and the person behind the desk in the police chief's office ought to be the police chief. So it is an ironic twist of roles there. Hello, welcome back to my channel. I am Jess Cannell, and we are in episode 2 of Chappaquiddick by Leo Damore. The subtitle is Power, Privilege, and the Ted Kennedy Cover-Up. We worked our way through a book all about the Kennedys, and one of the stories that stood out to us was the story of Mary Jo Kopechne, the young woman who had worked for Senator Robert F. Kennedy and tragically died in Ted Kennedy's car at the bottom of a pond. And so episode 1, we went through the circumstantial evidence of how she was found and her body position, her buoyancy, whether or not she had air in her body, and other details as well. So if you missed that episode, you'll want to go back and check it out, because the wonderful thing about Leo Damore's book is he goes methodically through each detail to help us understand the circumstantial evidence in the introduction and chapter 1. The things that stood out the most is, number 1, Leo Damore is a careful, orderly author. He is trying to give us a detailed and accurate account. The second thing that really stuck out and surprised me was that there were 2 open windows in the car, which, if we want to theorize that she spent time alive in the car, then we're going to have to sort out what to do with those 2 open windows. One was in the front. It was rolled down within an inch of full opening. So that's quite an opening. The other one was blown out and there were shards of glass around the frame, but it was right next to her. And so I don't fully understand what to do about those, but that's something else we noticed. The other thing that we talked about was that the diver, the search and rescue diver who found her in position, was very careful. He carefully observed everything in the car, and he was the only one to see everything in the car. So his observations that we recorded in chapter 1 matter a great deal. And then Police Chief Arena intends to be methodical. He does not seem like a shady guy who's trying to help anybody get away with anything. However, he is reactive to external pressures and even internal pressures that he feels. That's a quick overview of what we saw in chapter 1. Today, we are going to attempt to do chapters 2 through 4. So now let's get into chapter 2. Antone Betancourt he's 70 years old and he's a ferry master. He gets to the landing of the ferry and he asks Dick Hewitt, who's on the docked ferry boat called the On Time. He says, "Do you know about the accident? It's Ted Kennedy's car and there's a dead girl in it." Hewitt nods over in the direction of a weathered ferry house at the landing. Well, he's standing right over there with 2 men. So Betancourt goes over and confronts Ted Kennedy directly. And I just want to point out, this is our first encounter with Ted Kennedy in this book. And I just want to stop for a minute and say, I really appreciate how Leo Damore starts out this book. As I thought through why he chose this moment, he chose the 2 fishermen who first saw the car as the starting place. And it gets us right into the action, which is wonderful. But I also think it's the first known fact. Later, and today, we're going to see some of the facts that Ted Kennedy presents, and they're already obviously squishy from the first telling. And so I love the way Leo Damore starts us out with the absolute first known fact, which is around 8, 2 fishermen see the car. That's the first fact in this case. And so here we go, but this is our first encounter with Ted Kennedy. Senator, do you know there's a girl found dead in your car? Do you need a ride down to the bridge? So he's on Chappaquiddick at the ferry. He tells him, do you need a ride? It's just like, you know, 1.5 miles, 2 miles down to the bridge where the car is. Kennedy says, no, I'm going on over to town. Betancourt watches the On Time leave the landing from Chappaquiddick for the crossing to Edgartown, and minutes later the ferry is back. Hewitt, who is the ferry driver, makes several round trips during the next 5 minutes. Remember, it only takes about 4 minutes to get there and back and there and back. So it's a constant recurrence all through the day. Hewitt, this ferry driver, had observed Ted Kennedy and 2 other men milling around the ferry house. He wondered if the senator knew about the accident that he was hearing about. And the same idea had occurred to Steve Ewing, who is the ferry's deckhand, the 16-year-old. He thinks, because they've heard about the accident, and he thought he's waiting there for news about the accident. So they're trying to put logic to Ted Kennedy's movements, which is what we're going to be doing this whole time. I just have to say, this is the question. This is the primary question of what was Ted Kennedy doing and why was he doing it? These are top tier questions for us and for the investigation that's going to follow throughout this book. What was he doing? He had boarded, so listen to this, you guys. He had boarded the ferry shortly after Ewing reported for duty at 9 a.m. So a little after 9, Senator Kennedy gets on the ferry to Chappaquiddick, from Edgartown to Chappaquiddick, back toward the island where the accident had happened. And listen to this description. The senator greeted the boy with a cheerful "Hi" when Ewing collected 3 15-cent fares. So after the boat ride to Chappaquiddick, the 3 men had gathered at the ferry house, which was furnished with benches and a public telephone. So what we're being told is a little after 9 a.m., Senator Ted Kennedy gets on the ferry with 2 other men, pays the fares with a cheerful countenance, and they're headed toward Chappaquiddick. The 3 men then go to a ferry house, which was a little tiny weathered shack right at the edge of this ferry landing, and it had some benches and a public telephone. Hewitt and Ewing then are going back and forth, and at some point they walk off the docked ferry and Kennedy is going towards some parked cars, and Hewitt calls out, "Senator, are you aware of the accident?" A tall man wearing glasses answered, "Yes, we just heard about it." Hewitt and Ewing returned to the ferry. Kennedy and the tall man wearing glasses followed. Ewing, who is this 16-year-old boy who has just reported for duty at the ferry, he's a first-hand observer of Senator Kennedy in these moments, he tells us this time Kennedy looked worried. So we have a 30-minute time period where Senator Kennedy looks cheery, he says hi, and they're giving their rides back and forth, and then they go and talk. Now he's back by the ferry, but he looks worried. So it's important for us to remember these things and to take note. This is someone who has no agenda. He's a 16-year-old kid, just observing what he remembers, that initially Senator Kennedy was cheery. He's on the ferry boat with 3 men. They come over here, they talk in the ferry house for some length of time. And then when he sees him later, a tall man, so one of the 3 men, says, "Yes, we just heard about it." And now Senator Kennedy looks worried. So I have some questions about this. I don't want to taint our entire understanding of the book, but I already have questions. Later, we're going to see what Ted Kennedy's statement is. But if Senator Kennedy was at all involved in the car going into the water, if he knew the car was in the water, why was he cheery? Why was he heading over and then heading back? What's the movements about? Why is he coming and then going? And then why does this man say, we just heard about it? Is that Kennedy just informed them and they're just finding out about it? Is it that they just found out about it and they've informed Kennedy? I don't know. I'm just looking at the evidence here and trying to figure out what it means. If you have ideas, put them in the comments. I know there's everything from he was the driver, he did it, he knew, he abandoned her, total jerk, to he wasn't even in the car, he didn't even know what had happened until this moment. If you have some theory, one of those, or some alternate theory, please offer it in the comments. The final thing I would just want to point out about that is we should take this seriously because it's the exact same witness observing two very different countenances. Cheery, hi, no problem, everything's cool, life is good, life is bright, gonna have the regatta today. Cheery Ted Kennedy. And then in less than an hour, he sees a worried man with some friend who has said, yes, we just heard about it. Okay. Well, it was 9:50 a.m. when he spots Ted Kennedy on board the On Time, bound for Edgartown. Ewing got ready to take a photograph, and I'm going to put up right now the photograph that he took. He says, Kennedy jumped off before the ferry docked, and I wasn't really ready to take the photo. Ewing was apologizing for this photo. It's the first photo of Ted Kennedy that morning. He says, that's why the picture isn't very good, because I didn't get him full face coming at me off the ferry. I got him sideways because he just kind of jumped off before the ferry even fully docked. And so he's out of focus. But that's the photo. Ewing wasn't really sure why he had taken the picture. He says, I figured if someone in his party had been in an accident, it was a normal reaction for him to be over there checking things out, that he'd be concerned. He notes that Kennedy looked, quote, in fine shape, end quote, that he was smartly turned out in light blue pants, a white polo shirt, and canvas deck shoes. Now, my understanding, which we haven't gotten yet in this book, was that he had dressed for breakfast. He had been jovial that morning at breakfast. We're now getting the next time period. He's already had breakfast. He came here. He went across with three men. They had some sort of conversation in the ferry house. And now he has come back and this photo has been taken of him. I just want to be really clear about Ted Kennedy's movements so that as we look back at this, we will all have them clear in our heads. Well, Ewing went to a payphone at the dock to call his summer assistant. He wanted Hyde, this man, Bob Hyde, to stay at the accident scene while he maintained telephone contact with the newspaper that he was working for. He said, all I know is a car went into the drink and whoever was in it is involved with the Kennedy party. They think there might be more than one person in the car. So he's a newspaper man and his wheels are already turning. Like, I don't know what's going on, but we're going to want to keep an eye on this. And I want a friend to come and just stay right at the accident scene the whole time. Ewing is joined at the landing by an assistant editor of the Vineyard Gazette. This is a local newspaper. And boarding the ferry is the undertaker with the station wagon that he used as a hearse, and then his assistant and an associate medical examiner. So now the inspection folks and the support people are making their way across, but Ted Kennedy has just gone this way. Now other people are going out to the island. Mills, who is the associate medical examiner, he observed a dozen bystanders now on Dyke Bridge. And he sees Police Chief Arena in his wet t-shirt and bathing suit. He's going into the Dyke house. So that's where we are as we're entering the bridge. Arena is using Mrs. Malm's phone to call the police station. He tells Carmen Salvador, send someone down to the ferry to find Ted Kennedy, please. And she says, he's right here, Chief, and he wants to talk to you. Gets on the phone. I'm afraid, Senator, I have some bad news, Arena said. There's been another tragedy. Your car was in an accident over here, and the young lady is dead. I know, Kennedy said. Can you tell me, was there anybody else in the car? Yes, Kennedy said. Are they in the water? No, Kennedy said. Can I talk to you could I see you? So Irina says, well, do you want to come here or do you want me to come there? And he says, I'd prefer for you to come over here. So Irina doesn't even bother to change clothes. He hurries out of the Dyke house. He catches a ride with a doctor to get to the ferry landing so that he can get across to Edgartown. Irina is getting into the doctor's Land Rover when Brugier says, Huck, look, remember, he's like the extra police officer who had seen Ted Kennedy's car the night before. He said, Brugier tells him, Huck, look, saw the accident car or one just like it up at the corner around 12:45 a.m. the previous evening. 12:45, almost 1 a.m. Important to remember that. Irina doesn't give much notice to it, but remember, this is the second time he's heard about it. Huck Look had kind of mentioned it, but he had to get on his way, and then now he's being reminded about this accident. Right now, though, Irina is thinking, I'm about to go talk to a senator, so I need to pay. That's where his focus is I'm going to go do this thing. Brugier then welcomes Dr. Mills. He is the medical examiner. And Mills wants the body to be brought to the front of the police cruiser so that all the spectators over on the bridge won't be exposed to this dead body. Thank you, Dr. Mills. That's good. We want to guard her dignity and not have photos splashed or stories told. So Mills uncovers the blanket, and here's the quote. He finds, quote, a well-developed, well-nourished, very attractive young woman, end quote. Which, it doesn't sound like technical language to me. I don't know about you guys. Well-developed means like she's curvy, I think. Well-nourished means she's not scrawny, I think. Very attractive is completely like his personal opinion. So these do not sound like medical opinions to me. These sound like, why would he describe her this way? I don't know. I mean, I'm glad she's really attractive. She is a sweet young lady. Here's her photo, just as a reminder. This is what Mary Jo Kopechne's official photo looked like. But yeah, okay. And he finds her, this is professional language, incomplete rigor mortis. She, remember, had been holding herself in position. Her hands were stiff. Her arms were outstretched. She had been holding herself in position like this to avail herself, is what the search and rescue diver thought, of the little bit of remaining air in the compartment. So she's stiff in this position, and it says, this is how it's described by Leo Damore. Her arms were stretched outward from her shoulders as if to ward off an assault. Hands were frozen in a semi-claw. Quote, there was a fine white froth about the nose and mouth, flecked with a barely visible cobweb of blood that went directly to a capillary area on the left nostril. It was, in Dr. Mills's opinion, the characteristic foam that goes with a drowning case. He runs his fingers down her throat and around her hair, trying to feel for any skull fractures anywhere on her body. He unbuttons her blouse, and there's a lacy blue brassiere. He puts the stethoscope over the heart, confirms that there's no sound coming out. He feels her rib cage, and then he taps her chest. And it says he's repeating the procedure with varying degrees of pressure. Each time, water welled up from inside the lungs, creating a splashing sound. The lightest pressure produced water from the mouth and nose. Mills did not remove the bra to examine for any injury here. He just slides the slacks slightly down over her hips, exposing her enough to make an adequate examination, he says. I couldn't have removed her clothes without cutting them off because of rigor mortis. So rigor mortis, just in case we don't know, is the process that happens after death. The body hardens into position. And just like that diver, just like John Ferrer described in his search and rescue mission, he feels her thigh and it feels like wood. It feels hard to him. She has already hardened. And so she is fully into rigor mortis. Her body is stiff. And so therefore you don't have the capacity like we do when we slip our jeans on or off to kind of get a little wiggle room from the fat or the skin. Nothing's moving. Her body is hardened. The assistant mortician is just watching the examination, and he says, I more or less just kept my eyes open. He observed that water seeped out of the nose and the mouth when the body was turned on its left side. He says that probably came from the stomach. And Mills says, nope, I'm pressing her chest. That's water from her lungs. So he thinks she's turned over to her side. Oh, water's coming out of her stomach. But Mills explains, no, I'm pressing her lungs. So there is water in her lungs. I just want to point out here, this is a discrepancy that we're going to have to deal with, and I would imagine in later chapters we're going to get evidence for one or the other. Was she positively buoyant as the search and rescue diver felt that she still had air in her body? And or how much of her lungs were filled with water? Did she die of drowning immediately, or did she spend some time breathing under the water, potentially up to an hour before she succumbed? That's the question here that we're presented. And we have evidence that seems to go either way. So we're going to keep paying attention. Mills passes his hand over the back and abdomen, and he finds no evidence of any trauma. There's no injuries. He says this is an obvious and clear case of drowning. Later, when he's looking back at his assertion here, he says, after all, the girl was found in a submerged automobile. To him, it's like, why look hard at this? Duh, she's in a submerged vehicle underwater. But this lack of curiosity, the lack of an autopsy, the lack of careful, rigorous detail of how much water came out, etc., is going to plague this case, I think. Mills orders the mortician to remove the body to his funeral home, and he says, hold off on embalming. This medical examiner is a humble man, and he thinks, well, just in case, since it's connected to this important family, we might get a request for an autopsy. So we don't want to embalm the body yet. And he also thinks, I don't know if I don't know what should be done, but I'm just going to go ahead and hold off on embalming, but you guys can go ahead and take the body back to the funeral home. So that's his order. And he goes back in the hearse, and he thinks it's a shame, but he's moving on mentally. He's got a woman in labor that he needs to go help. And so he moves on. He's not consumed by this case. We start to see in this chapter a man named Jimmy Smith. He was the chairman of the Nantucket Steamship Authority. This organization provides boat service out to the islands, and he's got a call into him. Somebody says, there's been an accident. It's Ted Kennedy's car and somebody's dead. We don't know who it is yet, but I just thought you'd like to know. Now, Smith was an influential man who was well connected with the Kennedys. He had actually been a hardcore JFK kind of fanboy back in the day. He was like a legal foot soldier for JFK. And now he has transferred his allegiance to JFK's little brother. He served at his campaign. He spoke on his behalf at the Democratic State Convention. So he has now he's Team Ted, okay? And he's got a call. Then he starts calling other Kennedy associates. He calls Kenny O'Donnell, the former White House Appointments Secretary, and O'Donnell has little reaction to news of the accident. He says, okay, keep me informed. But he calls O'Donnell's brother, Warren, who's in Worcester, and he was an advance man for both Kennedy and Johnson's presidential campaigns. He had played football at Harvard with Ted Kennedy, so definitely a Kennedy insider. And he is reacting more volatile. He says, how can we help? What can we do? How can we even keep up with what's happening? So he's wanting to get in the loop. And they recognize this police chief is a friendly guy, but he's not one of us. So the main thing I wanted to say is James Arena is not necessarily a Kennedy man, but all the Kennedy men in the Kennedy machine are starting to grind into action. Calls are being made, legal people have their antenna up, and they are paying attention to what's happening already. And it's not even 10 a.m. So we have no statement from Senator Kennedy yet. He's barely made contact with the police. The car went into the water potentially sometime after 12:45 a.m. because that's when Huck Look saw it. But by 10 a.m. the next morning, Kennedy's legal team is already, even without his involvement, grinding into action. The main observations that I had from chapter 2 is it's already unclear when Kennedy learned of the accident. I'm not sure, but based on this order of events, I don't know. I hope to feel more confident about that by the end of the book. Number 2, I just note that significant change in countenance stands out to me by one guy who saw him one way, then sees him another way. Now, could Ted have been acting when he seemed jovial and hi? Sure, he could have been acting. He could have been trying to create an alibi and act like nothing was any big deal. We don't know Ted's psychology enough to say what his baseline behaviors are, but it's significant that there's a change, right? One of the things that I've learned from the behavior panel guys is that any significant change in behavior is noteworthy. We can't always say exactly what it means, but we do want to take note of it. Is why did he go from hi and paying his fare and no big deal to going and having a 30-minute conversation in a ferry house and then looking worried and hurrying, jumping off the boat early and making his way to the police chief office? What happened there? What was going on? That's what I want to know. And then also just that she had no signs of trauma, that Mary Jo, everything is buttoned up in her clothing. She doesn't look out of place. She doesn't look out of sorts, and there's no injuries to her head or person. That seems important to note. Okay, chapter 3. So Police Chief Arena goes into the town hall at 10 o'clock. He has no inkling of what's in front of him. He sees 2 local reporters standing there, and for the first time ever, Police Chief Arena denies them access to the police station. He says, can you guys go ahead and wait outside? And their antennas go up. Like, what is this? We've never been asked to not come inside. He's always really frank with us. So what is happening? Well, Arena goes in, and Carmen Salvador, she's the one who's been answering the phone all this time. She had been relaying messages back and forth about the accident when Ted Kennedy walked into her desk. How are you? He said. Can I use your phone? You can use the chief's, she said helpfully. And so she lets Kennedy into the adjoining office. She reports to Police Chief Arena, Kennedy looked really nervous. He seemed to think I knew all about what had happened, but I didn't. I just figured someone had taken his car for a joyride. A tall man had followed Kennedy into the station too, and he too had asked to use the telephone. Salvador watched him misdial the phone on her desk, make 2 calls that made no sense to her, and then join Ted Kennedy in Arena's office and close the door. So we've got Senator Kennedy coming in the door. Can I use the phone? She helpfully says, here, yeah, use this office. So he goes in, and tall man makes some phone calls that seem mysterious to her, or she doesn't understand what's being said. So I don't know if there's code language involved. I'm not sure, but there's something happening that she's not clear on. Like what's happening in that phone call? And then he goes in with the senator. Kennedy is using the phone when Police Chief Arena comes into his own office. He says, hello, Senator, I'm Jim Arena. Kennedy hung up and came around the desk to shake Arena's outstretched hand, and he says, hello, Jim. Arena recognizes tall man as Paul Markham. Here's a photo of him. He was the former U.S. attorney. Police Chief Arena looks at both of them and says, I'm sorry about the accident. Yes, I know, Kennedy said. I was the driver. Okay, this is the first sentence out of Ted Kennedy's mouth when he's one-on-one with the police chief. Interesting. I think this right here is the crux on which, whatever we judge, we're going to have to deal with this statement. For people who assert that he was not the driver, that he had no idea about this accident until he learned of it sometime right around the time of that ferry ride, ferry house conversation, and then back. If that's when he learned about it, then we've got to ask ourselves, why would he admit this? This does not seem like something a Kennedy would do, to confess to an accident that he had no part in. If he wasn't the driver, to me, it does not seem like he would just admit it. We'll see. But that's an interesting thing to note. Arena recalled later, nothing in my prior career. I'm going to put up a photo of him while I'm talking, by the way, just so you get a sense of the men who we're talking about. Police Chief Arena recalled later, nothing in my prior career as a police officer had prepared me for standing in a wet bathing suit and shaking hands with a United States Senator and a Kennedy who tells me he is the driver of a car from which I have just removed the body of a beautiful young girl. I was stunned. And he reflects this odd situation he's in, where Kennedy is the one who was in the car accident, and the police chief is the police chief, and yet one of them is behind the desk in dry clothes, and one of them has just come in wet clothes, and they're the exact opposite of what they ought to be. It really ought to have been Police Chief Arena in the desk and Ted Kennedy. I mean, the truth is, if he knew about it at 1 a.m., he ought to have called somebody at 1 a.m. from the Dyke House and gotten the rescue team in place if he knew about it. But, you know, at least if there's a car accident involving water, the person who was in the accident ought to be the one walking into the police chief's office, and the person behind the desk in the police chief's office ought to be the police chief. So it is an ironic twist of roles there. Arena had assumed that the accident victim had driven the car off Dyke Bridge herself. He says, I'm standing in a puddle of water in a state of confusion, thinking, I had only minutes before broken the news of this accident, and he's telling me quite calmly that he knew all about it. He gathers himself. He asks, do you happen to know where Rosemary Keogh is from so that we can notify her next of kin? It isn't Cricket Keogh. It's Mary Jo Kopechne, Kennedy said. I've already notified her parents. Arena asks how to spell her last name, and Kennedy only knew how to pronounce it. He did not know how to spell Kopechne. Okay, we can find out how to spell it later, Markham suggests. Kennedy says this, what would you like for me to do? We must do what is right, or we'll both be criticized for it. He says the senator's demeanor certainly worked a calming effect on me. Remember, Arena had been in a state of shock. John Ferrer, the diver, said he always normally was in a calm, placid demeanor, but that he had observed Police Chief Arena in a very agitated, anxious state whenever the body had been brought up. And so we're only less than an hour from that moment. So if we put ourselves in those shoes, Police Chief Arena has just had multiple very jarring effects happen in the last hour of his life. And so, you know, now he's back in his wheelhouse. When Kennedy says this to him, we got to do what's right or we're both going to be criticized for it, it kind of grounds Police Chief Arena. He says, I automatically fell back on years of police training and I began to just process the matter like it was a routine traffic case. So now he's back in his wheelhouse, he's back in his element, he's remembering what he needs to do, and he's doing it. As far as he can see, this is a motor vehicle accident. And he says, the first thing that we have to have is a statement from you about what has happened. Would it be all right if I wrote it out? Kennedy said. And he asked for undisturbed space to prepare the statement. So Arena leads him over to a town office and gives the senator some privacy. Kennedy asks Irina, can you go back to Chappaquiddick and make sure that my car got out and cleared okay? So Irina is glad for this reprieve. The admission that Senator Kennedy had been the one driving the car really had shaken him up. And so he's collecting his thoughts as he goes back to the ferry. He's trying to put together, okay, what facts do I know? What's the situation now? And he's kind of also reminding himself of the proper police procedures. Now that he's back in his right frame of mind, he's thinking, okay, what must we do in which order to make sure things are done properly? Dr. Mills is also taking pains to deal with this case well. And remember, he's a modest man. He's cautious and he doesn't want to just throw his weight around. He's not going to say like, we have to do an autopsy. It has to be done this way, blah, blah, blah. In his mind, the medical examiner has determined this is obviously a drowning. In his mind, again, normally in this kind of situation, an autopsy would not be done. It's clearly a drowning. She has water coming out of her lungs. In his observation, he felt she drowned. And so he didn't need to do anything else. He had checked her skull. There was no fractures. He's like, clearly a drowning, clearly not trauma. We're going to go ahead and call this a drowning. However, he calls into the state police barracks. He contacts the district attorney and he tells an officer, tell them I have the case of a girl who was trapped in a submerged vehicle for a matter of hours and has obviously drowned. Tell them that I am fully satisfied with my diagnosis of drowning by immersion, that I don't know who she is, but she's reputed to be an employee of the Kennedy family. And if it is the judgment of the district attorney or his assistant that an autopsy is indicated, then I'm asking for one. Note, he wasn't making the request for an autopsy for medical reasons. He didn't believe there ought to be an autopsy, but he thought, well, if it's the judgment of others that one should be done, then I'll ask for one. But otherwise, I'm fully satisfied with my diagnosis of death. To me, she drowned by immersion. It's very clear. And later, Mills gave this quote, we almost never do autopsies in drowning cases on the island. I was requesting the consideration of an autopsy because of the connection with a prominent family. That was particularly important in my mind. I felt it was too big an issue for me to handle single-handedly. I felt the evidence of drowning was conclusive, but I'm no detective. End quote. So that's the end of chapter 3. And the observations that I have from this chapter are Kennedy looked nervous. He was cheery when he got onto the ferry. Now he's nervous. He and Markham are making phone calls. We don't know who he's calling yet. May become clear later. We don't right now know who he was calling, but they're both making phone calls right up until the moment that the police chief enters the office. Immediately, Ted Kennedy admitted to being the driver of the car. And Police Chief Jim Arena was shocked. Also, the police chief notes that Ted Kennedy in that conversation appealed to him to, quote, do what is right. I mean, we can all say, like, this is a self-covering gesture, perhaps. But it is to Ted Kennedy's credit that he apparently did not try to, so how are we going to deal with this, sir? He comes in, is forthright, I was the driver, and says, we need to make sure we do things right so that we don't get criticized for it. I mean, there's a lot of case to be made that if he was the driver, he had already long since the ship had sailed for him to do what was right. The right thing would have been to walk yourself that 400 feet over to Dyke House to make a phone call. The light was on, people were home, you could have made a phone call, and we've already seen in chapter 1, it took 30 minutes from the call to Mary Jo being out of the water. And so had there been any air in the vehicle at all, which her body position suggests that there was, then that would have been a rescue mission rather than evidence gathering like it became. So already Ted Kennedy has probably not done what is right, although we can't say that for sure, because if he actually wasn't the driver, then this is all a facade that we don't really understand right now. The other thing I wanted to point out is they thought it was Rosemary Keough, and that's because remember the little lunch pail that had been turned into a purse had her effects in it. It had her cosmetics, it had her Senate ID badge, it had her driver's license in it. So she was thought to be, initially Mary Jo Kopechne was misidentified as Rosemary Keough. So, and then that the medical examiner thought it was an obvious drowning. That's important to us. He's not pushing for an autopsy, but he's open to one being done if the people involved want it. Okay, chapter 4. We're doing good on time, y'all. I feel so proud of us. This is an interesting thing. So the Registry of Motor Vehicles inspector was named George Kennedy. I don't believe there's any relation. It's not even explained in the book, which is a little odd, but I'm guessing because it's not explained that there's no relation between them. But it is odd that the inspector called to the scene of the accident is named George Kennedy. Interesting. He and his assistant are waiting for Chief Arena by the ferry landing, and he's a 14-year veteran of the registry. He's reputed to be a good investigator, and Arena thought he's a nice guy, but not too bright. The automobile, I'll put up photos, it had already been righted in Poocha Pond when Arena returns to Dyke Bridge. We have photos of this. We don't have as many photos of the submerged vehicle, but we do have photos immediately after the car has been pulled up, righted the right way up. It had been upturned, now it's righted, and it's been pulled to the shore. The current was still too swift for the car to be pulled fully from the water. Also, John Ferrer, who was that search and rescue diver, had observed large air bubbles rising to the surface when the automobile turned over. He was continuing to dive down. He's looking for more bodies because, remember, 2 of the windows had been blown out. And he's a well-trained search and rescue diver. So he is examining the area. It's murky water. There's a strong current. So he's making dives, just checking all around to see, are there any other bodies? Is there anything else that needs to be recovered from this accident? Arena tells him, you can call off your search. I have the driver. We know who the girl is. There was nobody else in the car. Okay, so Arena joins Red Kennedy and his assistant, George Kennedy, but his nickname is Red. So he joins Red Kennedy and his assistant there. They are taking measurements of the accident scene. So they're looking carefully. They note that Dyke Road is 15 feet wide at the bridge. They note that the bridge was built at a 27-degree angle to the road. So I'll try to find photos of this and also maps, and I'll just put those up here while I'm talking so that you guys can examine that for yourselves. But the road is 15 feet wide at the bridge. The bridge is built at a 27-degree angle from the road, and the car had landed 51 feet from the start of the bridge. It had catapulted 23 feet, 7 inches forward, and 5 feet outward from the exit gouges on the rub rail. So Inspector Kennedy notes, now you might remember, Arena's initial inspection was no skid marks on the bridge or dirt road prior to reaching the bridge that I could see. He had been the first one on the scene besides the fisherman. And so initially he notes no skid marks that he could see on the bridge or the dirt road prior to the bridge. Inspector Kennedy noted, quote, according to the skid marks, the wheel of the right side of the car skidded some 18 feet before it went over the rub rail. The wheel on the left side showed skid marks of 33 feet 2 inches to the point where the car left the bridge and flipped into the water. Remember, it had been going at such a speed that it had flipped like this and ended up landing and resting on the front of the vehicle. That front bridge of the windshield is where the weight had rested, okay? When the tide approached dead low, the car was then dragged from the pond. And as the rear end license plate emerges, Huck Look Watching the salvage operation from the bridge, he walks over to Officer Brugier to say, that is the same car I saw last night. So remember, at 12:45 the night before, he saw this car. Brugier then reports that to Police Chief Arena. Do you know who was driving the car last night? Arena asks him. And Look says he hasn't the slightest idea, only what I told Bob. It appeared to be a man and a woman, and maybe somebody else in the back seat. Okay, so I just want to point out, this isn't not having the slightest idea, right? Not having the slightest idea is like, I don't know, it was rainy, there was a figure inside, right? That's not having the slightest idea. But Huck Look says it appeared to be a man and a woman and maybe somebody else in the back seat. Y'all, that is very specific information, and that's not having not the slightest idea. Now, he didn't know the identity, so perhaps that's what he's communicating. In his report, it's not just a man and a woman, it's possibly 3 people in the vehicle. Let's just note, this is the last sighting of the car before the fishermen the next morning. So this is important data that we should pay attention to. This is the last set of eyeballs that saw this thing before it went off the bridge. Important. Man, woman, possibly someone in the back seat. Arena says, well, it was Senator Ted Kennedy. He is a registered Democrat, and he says, holy Jesus, which I don't like using Jesus's name like that, but that's a direct quote of what he said. And then, as if he's recanting, he says, I didn't see a thing, which is funny. He all of a sudden realizes, oh man. To Registry Inspector Kennedy, Look confirmed having seen a vehicle with similar description to the vehicle in the accident. And then Inspector Kennedy writes down, whose occupants looked like 2 persons, 1 male and 1 female, with male operating vehicle. So, I don't know what's been changed in translation, but it does seem that the potential for the 3rd person in the back seat has been stricken from the record. I don't know if that's because Huck Look doubted himself. I don't know if that's because Police Chief Arena is now kind of bringing the report to bear that he's just heard from Ted Kennedy. We don't know. But between the initial telling to Bob, the secondary telling to Arena, and now the 3rd telling to the registry inspector, that potential for a 3rd person has been left off. And now we're just being reported that there was a male and a female. And I think that's important, that this account removes the reference to that initial impression that he had. I tend to think we should rely more heavily on the eyewitness experiences in the moment than the reworked details that make it into the records later. That's my feeling. What do you guys think? So Diver Farrar wades out to the car. Remember, he's already spent time in this car. He's gone down into it. He's looked all around it. He's the one who found Mary Jo. He's the one who saw her sandaled feet in the rear window and then goes around and pulls her out. He goes back in. He's looking around. He finds the purse. He has been in that vehicle and around that vehicle. Well, now he's wading out to the car, and it says the rear wheels are resting upon the banking. The front end is still partially submerged. The windshield, though shattered, had been held intact by safety film. So that's good to know, because I had wondered, well, if it had been totally crashed and caved in, which was what I had read, why wasn't it cracked enough for somebody to get out potentially? And the safety film had held it together. Farrar notes that the momentum had carried the car over onto its roof. And for that reason, quote, I believed initially a large amount of air was trapped inside. That one window was open and 2 others were broken would not prevent an air bubble from forming. So he's saying just because the windshield is cracked, the back window is cracked, and a window is down, That doesn't mean that air can't be trapped inside the vehicle when it's rapidly turned over and submerged really fast. His assessment would be there would be water trapped in part of that vehicle that wouldn't just naturally escape through those lower broken windows, especially if they're further down under the water, that an air bubble could have been there in the vehicle. He begins noting all the things a careful observer would. The key was in the ignition, the light switch is in the on position, the gear wand was in drive. The car is full of broken glass. A hairbrush and a soggy newspaper are on the floor of the back seat. And when the trunk is opened, he notes it's remarkably dry. So potentially there had been air in the trunk as well, that's part of why that end was up. Arena, as he's looking at the vehicle, he is just getting more and more puzzled by the evidence. He says, I'm far from being an expert, but I did have certain training beyond that of an average person. Quote, the driver of the car would have to have taken a really hard blow to the head. The windshield on the driver's side was badly smashed in. Arena found it difficult to reconcile Ted Kennedy's appearance at the police station with what would have been the appearance of the driver of a car in such an accident. So he is comparing these two and thinking, how could Ted Kennedy have been in this position, head in the windshield, trauma to the body and to the person, and then have just walked into my office in his little deck shoes without an injury, without so much as a scratch? It's not making sense to him, and it's not making sense to me either. The other thing I want to note about the appearance of the driver is that not only did Ted not have those injuries, but I just want to point out, we've just been told Mary Jo didn't have those injuries either. She didn't have a big wound to the forehead. She wasn't scraped up with cuts all over her face. In fact, they call her attractive, well-proportioned. They feel her head. There's no injuries. We're not told there's like bleeding scarification over her face from shattered glass. So yeah, Ted Kennedy didn't have that. Mary Jo doesn't either. Neither one of them give the appearance that Police Chief Arena is looking for here of someone with clear evidence of facial trauma or head injury, bodily damage from hitting the windshield or being the driver of this accident. Neither one has that appearance. Just want to point that out. Police Chief Arena is looking through the glove compartment and finds the leatherette folder that has the registration, some maps, personal effects, that kind of thing. And it also has a lease of the rental of a cottage in Chappaquiddick to Joseph Gargan for 10 days, beginning July 10th. This morning is July 19th. So they had the cottage leased for 10 days. This is the 19th. It's nearing the end of their time at that cottage. A news photographer is now at the bridge, and he is there shooting on the scene photographs of the car being dragged from Poocha Pond. He just thinks it's a local matter of no particular significance, but it's going to make it in the newspaper, and so he's taking photos. Meanwhile, in front of Town Hall, the crowd of journalists is growing, and Arena is dismayed to find a political columnist for the New York Times there waiting for him. Arena says, well, I've just now found out about the accident, and right off the bat, I've got one of the most powerful newspapers in the country camped on my doorstep. Arena asks him to wait outside with the other reporters. So now he's got his kind of MO, which is y'all just wait outside. Reston is reverting to the style of an aggressive news hawk. He says he was a lot more excited than I thought he should have been about the accident, but he was obviously putting things together faster than the rest of us were at this point. So I just want to point out this New York Times reporter, he has the instincts that these guys don't yet have. He can smell the blood in the water, and he knows there's a story here and it could be massive, and he was right. Now, everybody knows that Ted Kennedy is inside, and reporters are slipping notes saying, could you let me go in and interview Ted? Can you get this note to him? Blah, blah, blah. And he's wanting to get in touch with Ted Kennedy before he can slip away. When Irina walks into the town office where they are, Paul Markham is seated at the desk and Teddy Kennedy is pacing. The statement was nearly finished, Markham tells him. And Irina, at this point, remember, he's been sitting on the undercarriage of the upturned car, then gone over and met Ted Kennedy. Now he's gone over and he's seen the actual windshield and the interior of the car, and now he's back across at Edgartown, and he takes a long, hard look at Ted Kennedy. He says, quote, I found it hard to believe the senator had been in a major automobile accident. His face bore no traces of any marks. He never sat down or appeared in any kind of physical discomfort. If he had been injured, in shock, or confused, nothing of it lingered in our meeting, to my observation. So he is holding up the evidence, and then he's holding up Ted's word, and he's saying, there's no evidence of any kind that he was the driver. And yet, he says, quote, but the senator made it a point to tell me 3 times without my asking that he was the driver of the accident car. It was as though he wanted to make sure I got it right. Irina could think of no reason why Ted Kennedy would admit to it if it weren't true. Again, that is the crux of the matter. Why does the evidence show that he wasn't the driver, but why would he admit to being the driver if it wasn't true? That doesn't make any sense. Markham eventually comes into Irina's office with the accident report, and Irina is having trouble reading Markham's handwriting. So he goes, do you mind if I type this up? I'll put that here as well. This is the typed version. Markham thinks it's a good idea. And so he initially intends to have Carmen sitting out at the desk be the one who transcribes the 2 pages, but she's busy. The phones are going like crazy. So Irina just sits down himself and types out the statement. He had no difficulty deciphering it, but he notes that there's a spiky scroll and there's lots of cross outs and right overs where Markham was transcribing the dictation from the senator. But what Irina read astounded him, and I am going to read it to you entirely. He says, no wonder Ted Kennedy was showing no ill effects from the accident. According to this verbatim report, the accident had occurred more than 10 hours ago. So at this point, Police Chief Irina is thinking, Look saw the car at 12:45, but these guys find the car. Ted Kennedy's barely back and forth. He's trying to make sense of why does he look so cleaned up. Now he's like, oh, it's been 10 hours. Here's the statement. And just so you know, I'm going to withhold my commentary until I've read the entirety of the statement, and then I'll come back and give some commentary. On July 18th, 1969, at approximately 11:15 p.m. in Chappaquiddick, Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts, I was driving my car on Main Street on my way to get the ferry back to Edgartown. I was unfamiliar with the road and turned right onto Dyke Road instead of bearing hard left on Main Street. After proceeding for approximately 1/2 mile on Dyke Road, I descended a hill and came upon a narrow bridge. The car went off the side of the bridge. There was one passenger with me, one Miss Mary blank, comma, a former secretary of my brother, Senator Robert Kennedy. The car turned over and sank into the water and landed with the roof resting on the bottom. I attempted to open the door and the window of the car, but have no recollection of how I got out of the car. I came to the surface and then repeatedly dove down to the car in an attempt to see if the passenger was still in the car. I was unsuccessful in the attempt. I was exhausted and in a state of shock. I recall walking back to where my friends were eating. There was a car parked in front of the cottage, and I climbed into the back seat. I then asked for someone to bring me back to Edgartown. I remember walking around for a period, and then going back to my hotel room. When I fully realized what had happened this morning, I immediately contacted the police. That's the statement. A few quick notes about it. One is that right out of the gate, that 11:15 time period can't be true if Huck Look's statement is correct. Look said that it was 12:45 p.m., almost 1 a.m. So 11:15 is quite a bit sooner than that. That's number one. Number two is that the Farrar diver, I listened to an interview by him, and he said that Ted Kennedy had been on Chappaquiddick with JFK in 1955. And he had even driven on Dyke Road the day of the accident. So it can't be true that he was unfamiliar with the road. So we have to figure out what to do with that. Was he drunk as a skunk and had no idea where he was? Was he in a panic? We have to figure out what to do with that. He was not unfamiliar with the road. He was quite familiar with the road. I want to point out that the car position is accurate. The car did turn over and sink into the water and landed with the roof resting on the bottom. And to our knowledge, Ted Kennedy has not returned to the scene of the accident. So either he knew it because he had been in the accident, or he knows it because someone else has seen the accident and reported it to him. Whatever the case, he gives an accurate description of the position of the car. It did land with the roof resting on the bottom. That's true. It says, I attempted to open the door and the window of the car, but have no recollection of how I got out of the car. I just want to note, a window was rolled down, almost entirely. When he says, and after attempting to dive down, that he was exhausted, I just want to remind all of us that in episode 1, we saw that Arena was exhausted from the tides. And so that would be an accurate description of how the tides interacted with someone diving down into it near the car. That is exactly what Arena experienced. The other question I had when I was reading it was, he uses this word, when I fully realized what had happened this morning. And I think this is a critical question. What did he actually mean by this? Did he mean that he had been through the accident and then just had, as he kind of said later, like in a way that doesn't even make sense to him, he had just kind of put it out of his mind and thought, it'll all work itself out, I'm not going to worry about it. And then he, with horror, at some point perhaps when men are talking sense to him in the fairy house, fully realizes what had happened. Or did something else happen? Did he not realize it had taken place and then he fully realizes what has happened? Not sure, but that phrase is interesting, when I fully realized. So Arena types it out. He sees various people in the office, and they start asking, clamoring to get to see Kennedy, and he's kind of holding them off a little bit. Markham wants to ask, he says, the senator wants the statement looked over by this attorney, a Kennedy family lawyer named Burke Marshall. They're trying to get a hold of him. The senator asks, could you please hold it until I talk to Burke Marshall? Arena has some questions that he wants to ask, and he is specifically focused on the long delay between the accident and when it was reported. Markham assured him the senator will answer questions after he has consulted his attorney. Arena agrees to hold the statement and forgo further questions. And he says this is something that he regrets as, quote, something of a low point in my particular case. So he regrets having made this decision, but that's the decision that he made. And again, I think we're seeing indications that this is how he responds to pressure. He feels this pressure and he says, sure, yeah, it seems reasonable. Well, let's just go on and talk with your lawyer. I'm not going to ask any questions. And had he pressed a little bit, in that moment, he was already seeing some of the contradictions. And so he was in a position to ask some hard questions and potentially get some interesting, clarifying answers for us, but he didn't do it. We don't have that, and he regrets it. There we go. Arena says, well, can I see your license? So remember, he's at least trying to go according to procedure. He says, can I see your license? The senator didn't have it with him. He says, I can't find my wallet. Arena wanted to know, had your license been properly renewed? Kennedy is sure that it had been. Massachusetts law required every driver to have a license upon his person or in some easily accessible place for presentation after an accident. Police could arrest without warrant and keep in custody for 24 hours any person operating a motor vehicle who did not have a license in his possession. The senator's inability to produce his valid license was a clear violation of the law. But Arena doesn't even think about pressing charges. Again, I think he is just wowed by the personage in front of him. He is thinking critically about the accident. He doesn't seem to want to he doesn't seem personally inclined to roll over and take it from the senator, but he does seem intimidated, and the pressure impacts the choices that he makes in this moment. He's bending police procedure here. The lack of a license, combined with the delay in reporting the accident, for sure could have been enough. And these are complications that showed, hey, maybe this shouldn't be handled just like a normal standard traffic violation here. Maybe this isn't just a routine traffic case, Police Chief Arena. But he's not thinking about that. An attorney named Steele catches a glimpse of Ted Kennedy, and he feels delighted that Ted Kennedy recognizes him and waves across the office. So he walks into the police station and recognizes Paul Markham. He says, "How are you?" And it was clear that Markham was not well. He's red-eyed, his face is drawn with exhaustion. He looks like he had had a rough night. He stood up and abruptly announced, "I'm going over to the Shiretown Inn." Clearly he's exhausted, and I just personally am noting like the way that Arena expected Kennedy to look. He doesn't look like that at all. He doesn't look exhausted. He doesn't look injured. He doesn't look bothered. Markham, we aren't told of any injuries, but he's red-eyed. He's exhausted. He's a mess. He does at least bear the marks of a rough night, right? Even if he doesn't bear scratch marks and cut marks, he shows exhaustion. Markham goes the 2 blocks to the Shiretown Inn, and he begins collecting items, stuffing them into a canvas bag. By the time he's come back, Markham is giving just half-sentence answers. Ted Kennedy had driven a car off Dyke Bridge. He had escaped the accident uninjured, but a young woman accompanying him had drowned. The accident had gone unreported for more than 9 hours. Steele is absolutely astonished. He curses, and Markham says, "I know." Yeah. Steele says, "There might be a problem." Yeah. Well, we're near the end of chapter 4 now. Senator Kennedy was sequestered in the office. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law, etc. And the senator listens glumly, says he understands his rights, and Inspector Kennedy asks for the senator's driver's license and registration. The senator thought the registration was in the accident car, and he didn't have his license with him. He said, "Sometimes I leave it in my car in Washington because I own 2 cars. I will place a call for you immediately and see if I didn't leave it there." Remember, the point isn't to have a license, it's to have it on you immediately following an accident, right? So he's in violation, but Kennedy calls his Senate office in Washington. He asked his administrative aide to see if the license had been left in the other car and to provide the name, address, and date of birth for Mary Jo Kopechne. Inspector Kennedy reads over the senator's statement. He said, "I would like to know something." "I have nothing more to say," the senator said. "I have no comment." Markham assures the inspector the senator will make a further statement after he has contacted his lawyer. And Arena just notes the cool manner that the senator had maintained throughout his 3 hours at the police station is now starting to unravel. He's no longer cool and collected. Markham is quickly calling air charter services to try to book a flight to Hyannis. Another thing that Arena did that probably he regretted later is he makes way for Senator Kennedy to leave the office without having to deal with the press. He provides an escape route, and he leads him to a utility room in the rear of the building. That door provided access to the parking lot. One reporter gets a look at him and notes, he says he tried to get a statement, but Kennedy wouldn't say anything. But the senator, quote, appeared very shook. He looked like the wrath of God, end quote. The way we're left off is that en route to the airport, Kennedy is muttering, "Oh my God, what has happened? What has happened?" He repeated this phrase over and over again during an uneventful 10-minute flight to Hyannis Airport. Carol taxis the plane and the passenger side door opens. Ted Kennedy climbs out, drenched in perspiration. The man who observed him says he looked like he was in a semi-state of shock, end quote. So, final observations from chapter 4. We have careful measurements made of the car, the angle, the skid marks, etc. Deputy Sheriff Look, we want to remember, said he saw 2 people in the front, male and female, and possibly someone in back. We noticed that the windshield is smashed, but Ted and Mary Jo do not bear marks as if they were the driver. This stood out to Arena. It should stand out to us. Kennedy's account is that he was the driver. He asserts this 3 times very quickly to Police Chief Arena. He took 1 hour to make his written statement that's full of cross marks and rewriting, and he still wants to review it with lawyers. So it's not a straightforward, this is what happened, blah, blah, blah. He is carefully choosing his words. Whatever you believe about what happened, he's being very cautious about this written statement. We see that Ted Kennedy has no license to produce. We also see that everyone is appalled that it took at least 9 hours of a delay to report this accident. According to him, it took 10, almost 11 hours to report the accident. We note that Markham is visibly exhausted. And now, as opposed to the beginning of the morning, we see Ted Kennedy scrambling and stressed, and he is intaking the reality of what has just happened. He is now in shock. He was not in shock when we met him at the ferry side. Now he is scrambling and shocked and clearly visibly stressed to everyone who sees him. He's drenched in perspiration. He's shutting down questions. He wants nothing to do with any of it. So the questions that I have for you guys at the end of all of this is, what do you make of Ted Kennedy's change in countenance and his movements throughout the morning? The underlying questions to that is, what did he know? When did he know it? And what logical set of events explains his movements? Because they seem illogical. Number 2 would be the seeming discrepancy between the positive buoyancy that the diver described versus the water seeping from the lungs that were described in chapter 2 by Dr. Mills and observed by the undertaker. Number 3 that we need to deal with is Ted Kennedy's confession and statement. And for that, I just actually want to point you to the Life magazine. I will link to it in the description. The Life magazine that was printed less than 2 weeks after this happened took apart Ted Kennedy's statement line by line, and that is worth listening to. We went through it in our review of Ask Not, so I'm going to link to the same video because it is very interesting, the immediate response of Life magazine to this written statement. So I want to point you to there. Another issue is the different perceptions of the skid mark data. We have Jim Arena's initial thought that there wasn't a long skid mark, and then the inspector, the vehicle inspector, who noted measurements of specific skid marks that he observed. So I'm sure that will come into play later. And then, were there 3 individuals in the car? Y'all, this is like the biggest question in my mind is, where was Mary Jo out of those 3? Where was Ted? And where were those potential 3 people when the car went off the bridge? seems very, very important to decide what we're going to do with those 2 or 3 people. Where were they? Why weren't there injuries on these 2 at least? Could there have been injuries on a 3rd person? Potentially. That's something in my head I just want to say. And then finally, the difference between the confession that's made versus the evidence. There's no injuries, there's no scratch marks, there's no discomfort or seeming exhaustion. This is important. Paul Markham is exhausted. Ted Kennedy doesn't seem to be exhausted. So how do we make sense of all of this? Well, this is episode 2. I really appreciate you guys sticking with me. If you made it this far and you are not subscribed, please subscribe because I want you on this journey with me. And please like and share this video with someone that you think would be interested, because y'all, I am fascinated by this book. I hope you are too. And if you've made it this far, then you are. So share it with a friend and let's all discuss it together. I hope you have a great day. Bye.